This is lecture 4 in the series on density management, and in previous lectures we looked at stand dynamics, like stages A, B, and C, and so on. We then looked at size density relations, including maximum size density, which would be the boundary line, and we also examined trajectories of stand development. We then followed up in the last lecture with a discussion of relative density, how we quantify the size density relationships and therefore competition and so on, other things that we're interested in silviculturally. We are going to, while there are many indexes of relative density, we're going to be using Reinecke's stand density index, which is based on the relationship between quadratic mean diameter and absolute density. So this lecture 4 will be the last of the conceptual or foundational material, and then we'll, starting in lecture 5, we'll go on and actually apply this in realistic scenarios. So this lecture will be on growing stock relations, and we're going to be looking at the relationship between individual tree growth and relative density, and then stand growth versus relative density. And one of the take-homes from this is you can't have your cake and eat it too, and by that you can maximize individual tree growth, or you can maximize stand growth, but you cannot do both simultaneously. And the reality is that almost all density management plans involve some situationally appropriate trade-off. Give up a little individual tree growth, give up a little stand growth, in a way that's appropriate to your particular situation, and your particular situation is going to differ from one management scenario to another. Okay, now we're going to set this up with. I'd like you to think about a planting trial. So we've got a bunch of land. It's all bare ground and completely uniform in terms of site quality, so very homogeneous. And we've picked a particular species that we're going to plant to do this spacing trial. So what that means, and we're going to plant this all at the same time. So we are holding species, site, and age constant in this hypothetical experiment. So species, site, and age are held constant. And so we grid off our huge plot of land. Maybe this is several hundred acres, and we engineer in some, perhaps they're big 1 acre plots, and we'll refer to those, or I will refer to those as individual stands. I mean, it's just kind of a shorthand. So when the day comes that we're going to plant this trial up, on 1 acre we plant one tree right in the middle of the acre, so an incredibly low density, obviously. And then on another acre we plant several thousand seedlings per acre, and then on various acres in our experiment, everything in between. So we've got this huge range of initial density that we're establishing across these plots, or stands, as I'm calling them. So we've got species constant, same thing across the whole unit. Site quality is constant, it's the same, it's a uniform site, and the age is constant. When we're finished, it's year 1. Now we're going to come back, I don't know, maybe 25 years from now. So we come back at the beginning of the growing season. all of our plantings are 25 years old, and we do a very careful measurement of all of the trees on all of our plots at the beginning of the growing season, and then we come back at the end of that growing season and we carefully remeasure everything. So I'm making a point of that because it's a little bit later we're going to look at the implications with regard to net versus gross growth. So we actually have, because of our careful pre-growing season measurements coupled with the post-growing season measurements, we'll be able to keep track of not only mortality and the growth on survivors, but even the little bit of growth that on trees that didn't make it through that growing season. So we have just conceptually here, the idea that we've got a very, very careful accounting of growth. Okay, with that set up, we're in the fall. We've done our measurements and we've got data, and let's do a little virtual walkabout in the spacing trial. So we'll go to the first stand, and 25 years ago we planted one tree right in the middle of that plot. The tree is there, and it's never competed a day in its life. Very, very low relative density, and the current annual increment for that tree is as good as it can possibly be for this species, site, and age, 25 years. Now, on a per acre basis, the growth is terrible. I mean, we've got one tree, so it's not it doesn't amount to much. Let's go to the next plot. 25 years ago, we planted two trees, and I promise I'm not going to take you through all the way to the several thousand that we planted on another plot. But so on the second plot that we visit, 25 years ago, we planted two trees, sort of equidistant, spread out on that acre, and neither one of these trees has competed a day in its life, and the growth is at its potential. Excuse me. Those two trees are growing just as well as the single tree on the first plot that we visited. When we consider growth on a per acre basis, it is exactly double what we saw in the first plot. There are two trees, and instead of one, and they're growing very well. So our growth is double. Pardon me. And so on, and we keep going, and we're walking around from one plot to another and increasing relative density until we finally get to a plot where just this last year the trees have started to compete. 25 years ago we planted enough so that they, for 24 years they grew without competition, but they've just started to compete. And the growth per tree is slightly less than what it could be. It's slightly less than what we've seen so far in our walkabout. Now, the growth per acre is greater. It's greater than we've seen up to this point in our examination of these results. But you notice the way that this figure's grown, that the growth it's not a linear increase as we go from one plot to the next. If we were to extend this line straight out, you'll see that this is increasing with increasing relative density. It's increasing at a decreasing rate. So there's this curve. Okay. Now let's continue on. Oh, excuse me. I need to back up just a little bit before we leave zone A. No competition, individual trees growing at their potential, and stand growth is directly proportional to relative density. So this linear part of it. Now, as we get into stands where there is competition, the individual stands have entered stage B, so I'm calling it zone B here in this on these figures. Competition has begun, and tree growth is inversely proportional to relative density, so it's decreasing with increasing relative density. Stand growth is increasing at a decreasing rate as we move from one plot to another with increasing relative density. So hopefully that's clear. Stage C, the trends that we saw in zone B continue. Additional increases in stand growth, however, are pretty modest. So, from one side of zone C to another, this isn't really a plateau. It isn't completely flat, but essentially, if we're at this relative density for this species site and age, if we're at this relative density, for all practical purposes, a relative density in this above this threshold really represents full site occupancy. In contrast, the reductions in individual tree growth with increasing relative density are considerable. So there's a to increase relative density from here to here represents substantial decrease in individual tree growth and not much gain in stand growth. We finally get to a plot, and it currently has this relative density. Again, reductions in individual tree growth are considerable. These trees are growing very slowly, certainly compared to what they could be for this species site and age. And on a stand basis, gross growth is high. Now this is everything. This is growth including trees that continue to survive, but it also includes growth on trees that didn't make it through the growing period, that they put on a little bit of growth and then they died, and we're counting that in gross, and so gross growth continues to be high. Net growth, however, declines because of the density related mortality. Okay, that's an important distinction. Okay, now some key relative densities. Remember, each species has a maximum SDI. So for red pine, it's 500. And if this was a series of red pine spacing, the spacing trial was based on red pine, the relative density, the observed relative density divided by 500 would give you the percent SDI max. So that's the game that we're playing. It allows us to compare things across species. So crown closure and the onset of competition is associated with about 25% of the max SDI. The lower limit of full site occupancy is about 35% of max SDI, and the lower limit of self-thinning is about 60% of max SDI, and of course the boundary line is 100%. Now, so this is about 25% of max SDI. This is 35% of max SDI, 60% of max SDI, and somewhere out here would be 100%. So to illustrate that, this is western hemlock and a bunch of stands that are self-thinning. And here's the boundary line, the max representing the max SDI for western hemlock. And this line parallel to it is 60% of this maximum, and you can see that it forms a threshold. Stands would, the way that the axes are set up here, if you had 2,000 trees per hectare, they would, as they grew, they would increase in quadratic mean diameter. They would get into this self-thinning zone, stage D, and the trajectory for an individual stand would come down here either very close to the boundary line or not so close, but above 60% of max SDI. Drew and Fuelling, who did some of the early work in North America with size-density relationships and relative density, referred to this as the zone of eminent competition mortality, which was pretty clever. I mean, their choice of this phrase. The idea being that if you've got a stand whose combination of mean size and density puts it in this zone, if competition-related mortality, if self-thinning hasn't started yet, it will soon. So imminent competition mortality is what they chose to call that. Okay, another way to illustrate this. So here's the boundary line for a hypothetical species. This is the maximum size density relationship, maximum SDI. Those are synonymous for us. And we look at a trajectory. So we have a stand that we start off at this initial density, and it's increasing in average size, and eventually that stand transitions from stage A to stage B. So, and everything that's associated with stage B, individual tree growth less than its potential, so on and so forth. And that happens at 25% of the max SDI. Stand continues to grow. Individual tree size is increasing, and eventually the stand enters stage C. So we have full site occupancy. The stand is capturing essentially all of the growth potential of the site. That's another way of saying stand growth is at its potential for this species, site, and age, and that occurs at about 35% of the max SDI. Similarly, as the stand continues to grow, individual trees are increasing, relative density is increasing, get to about 60% of max SDI, and the stand begins to self-thin. Okay, so we have these areas, and in terms of the growth growing, any stand of this species, regardless of its site and age, if it has a combination of mean size and density that puts it down here, it's in stage A. Okay. Conversely, or alternatively, if its combination of mean size and density puts it in here, it's in stage B, stage C, stage D. We're going to be able to use this. I mean, this is really important to us in terms of planning thinnings, and we're well on our way to being able to do that.